Master, wardens, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It is a great honour to be asked to give this year's Harrison Lecture. In last year's lecture, Sir George White took us back to the very beginnings of the company and its difficult early years against the troubled backdrop of the Civil War. For this evening, I thought it would offer an interesting counterpoint to bring the focus exactly 300 years forward, to a story also overshadowed by war, 2 world wars in fact, and to highlight the roles played by 3 liverymen in the period 1930 to 1950, from the Depression to the New Jerusalem, as my title has it. I'm going to be talking a lot about Smiths this evening, mainly because writing the firm's history has filled the last 3 years of my life, but also, and please trust me on this, Smiths offers a very good proxy for the whole clock and watch industry. As to the livery, the central characters in my story tonight are: first, Sir Alan Gordon Smith, raised to the livery in January 1934, who joined the court in 1938, serving as junior warden in 1944. His wartime commitments prevented him from progressing further. Second, Harold Buckland, liveryman from October 1934, junior warden in 1954, progressing to master in 1957. Finally, Dennis Barrett, liveryman also from October 1934, junior warden in 1949, progressing to be master in 1952, during which year a commemorative plaque was installed at Thomas Tompion's cottage at Ickwell. Barrett was master again in 1970. These 3 liverymen, 2 of whom served as master, were at the heart of a particular episode of British clock and watchmaking in the mid-20th century, a sort of last hurrah, and they serve as an interesting reminder of the radical changes seen in horology in the last 150 years. They will first have come together during the Great War, and I managed to find a picture from soon afterwards, from mid-1919, when S. Smith & Sons took its staff on a riverboat outing. And here they all are, Barrett to the far left, just 18 years old. And so to our story. By the late Edwardian period, Germany had achieved a dominant position in European clock manufacture and exports. Its control of the British market was vice-like. In 1913, 85% of the clocks imported into Britain were from Germany. With the Great War, British clockmaking firms suffered losses of staff through conscription or secondment to munitions factories. But overall, the war saw the growth of firms such as S. Smith & Sons and Williamson's of Coventry, both firms making good profits, having successfully diverted mass production effort not only into increased production of timekeeping devices, but into military products. Samuel Smith's speech to his shareholders in late 1918 was typical, when he was reported as saying, to quote, "The company had filled its part in the helping on to victory, and there was no reason why they should not gain their fair share of the fruits of that victory." The immediate bullishness of the post-war period rapidly gave way to gloom and doom, as a short-lived boom turned to bust, with many firms failing. Wholesale prices halved over 2 years, manufacturing production collapsed, and unemployment soared. For those companies that survived, the road to recovery was long. In Germany, by contrast, economic and industrial recovery was well underway by mid-decade, assisted by the 1924 Dawes Plan. From the readoption of the gold standard in 1925 until its final abandonment in 1931, British exporters faced an uphill struggle, since the strength of sterling tended to favour imports over exports. This suited German manufacturers of clocks in the Black Forest, who wanted to recover their pre-war dominance of the British market. There were tariff protections for certain British industries in place, such as the McKenna duties, named after Reginald McKenna, a wartime chancellor, levied at 33.33% on imported luxuries, including clocks and watches. But such duties only really had any bite if the relevant foreign imports were priced on a comparable basis to domestic products, and in the case of clocks, this was palpably not the case. British industry naturally called for the protection of domestic manufacture, and that protectionism found expression in 1925 through the Federation of British Industry's successful call for the introduction of a Buy British Goods campaign, reviving a wartime programme. Turning to the motor industry, one of the success stories of the decade, companies such as Humber insisted that the clocks they bought, in this case from Smiths, should be entirely British-made, and by the late 1920s, Smiths provided some 95% of the clocks required by the car industry, about 100,000 per annum and increasing. What Humber and others did not know was that though 75% of the labour and material in these car clocks was British, they were made in Cricklewood, the platform escapements were actually imported from the Tavan Watch Company of Switzerland under a long-standing agreement, as there was still no British capacity for the mass production of such a precision item. Despite Smiths having the agreement of the Board of Overseas Trade that using a Swiss escapement did not invalidate their claims to make British clocks, others disagreed. What followed, in my view, was the catalyst to the recreation of a British clockmaking industry. In early 1927, arguing a strict interpretation of the regulations, William Edward Tucker of Williamson's persuaded the BHI to issue proceedings against Smiths for infringement of the Merchandise Marks Act. Smiths lost in court and needed to take prompt action to protect market share. Having acquired the services of the Swiss-trained horologist René Lenoir through buying a controlling stake in the UK speedometer business of Jaeger, Smiths rapidly deployed this very capable engineer in the development of an entirely new enterprise, the All-British Escapement Company, known as ABEC. It took from 1928 to late 1931 to organise the new firm, and between times the May 1929 election returned a hung parliament, only months before Wall Street crashed, heralding the start of the Depression. Some were nervous about Labour's plans for tariffs, and it is instructive to note Gordon Smith's clear message to the government in January 1930, and in particular his ultimate goals. He wrote, "If the McKenna duties on motor cars and motor accessories are continued, a special clause should be inserted to include motor clocks, even if it is decided to abandon the McKenna duties on clocks and watches generally, a course which I should deplore in view of my plans for the establishment of a watch and clock-making industry here." Gordon Smith wrote again 2 months later in similarly clear terms. "The government may consider the watchmaking industry is of somewhat minor importance, whereas in fact I have plans for building up what is virtually a new industry in this country." It took until late 1931 for ABEC to become operational, but its emergence opened the door to the creation of a mass market in small, spring-wound mantle clocks. There was also room to move into larger pendulum clocks, and the misfortunes of 2 other companies played a role. Williamson's business had shown a marked decline in the 1920s, and the firm was insolvent by mid-1931, largely blamed on low-priced German import competition. In 1932, Smiths acquired its subsidiary English Clock and Watch Manufacturers, which made domestic clocks, typically pendulum mantle clocks, and also an electric car clock under the Empire brand, the brainchild of Harry Norman Walford, who was later raised to the livery in 1944. With this transaction, Smiths acquired both an important and gifted engineer, but also an important brand, Empire, which worked well against the backdrop of Buy British sentiment, and also the brand Astral, both brands made famous by Smiths over succeeding decades. Back in 1929, a small team of German émigrés, headed by Karl Schatz, had imported from the Black Forest a production line for inexpensive spring-wound clocks, setting up in Enfield, West London, as the Enfield Clock Company. For a time, the company thrived, exploiting a successful volume production model. But Enfield found itself competing with very similar products to its own, still being imported from Germany, at ever-reducing prices. The firm was therefore open to an approach from Smiths in mid-1933, which acquired control, and thereby another brand, Enfield, also to be made famous by Smiths over the next 20 years. So much for mechanical spring-wound clocks. Another vastly important feature of the late 1920s had been the gradual standardization of the electricity grid, following the adoption of the Electricity Supply Act of 1926, providing an accurate time base. Just 500,000 houses were connected in 1919, but from 1926, numbers increased rapidly, reaching 8 million by 1938, or two-thirds of the housing stock, though these numbers should be treated with caution, as the majority of houses only had a lighting circuit, and perhaps one socket. Despite the small numbers of houses with a full complement of wall sockets, here was an expanding market for clocks, and early in the 1930s, the clock trade woke up with a start to discover there was a new product, pushed hard by Smiths, threatening their livelihood. Here was a clock with no delicate escapement. It simply plugged in. The hands were set, and away it went, potentially for many years, with no hint of the service necessary for traditional clocks. Another outstanding engineer was involved, Dr. Ernest Annesley Watson, named on more than 100 patents between 1911 and 1948. By late 1930, he was engaged on the design of a suitable synchronous clock motor, and it was his fundamental design that was to serve Smiths for many years. As the country went to the polls in the election of October 1931, synchronous clock production commenced at Smiths, and in December, the watch and clockmaker ran a highly positive illustrated feature on the firm. This described the ABEC operation at Smith's new Kronos works, managed by one of our key actors, Harold Buckland, with Lenoir. It was at this stage that a bit of Smith's folklore came into being. Apparently, Buckland enjoyed taking people on a tour of the state-of-the-art clean rooms at Kronos Works, and would tell visitors, "We don't allow the girls to get colds here. Imagine if they sneezed." It became a sort of catchphrase for the rest of his career, immortalized in this later cartoon, The Girl Who Sneezed in the Watch Assembly. The watch and clockmaker also discussed the new electric clocks at Cricklewood, production running at 1,000 clocks a week, rising quickly to 4,000 a week by January 1932. Smiths had single-handedly revived the clockmaking industry, but in a new and modern guise. Looking at the larger market for mechanical clocks, the growth was equally spectacular, seen in this chart. From just 24,000 clocks produced in Britain in 1930, the numbers reached 636,000 inside 2 years, and a formidable proportion of this was down to Smiths and its new factories. This growth occurred despite the onset of the Depression and the simultaneous dip in house building between 1930 and 1932. From 1933, however, house building in England and Wales recovered, and the market for clocks followed suit. Despite success in building domestic production, the question of imports remained of crucial importance. In 1930, the Board of Trade figures revealed that out of a total of 3.7 million clocks imported, nearly 90% came from Germany, from factories such as this. Soon after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933, and despite active lobbying against it, Britain and Germany concluded a new Anglo-German trade agreement designed to increase British coal exports to Germany. But the quid pro quo exacted by Germany included reductions in tariffs for certain German imports to Britain, and these included clocks. For most categories, the duty rate fell from 33 1/3 to 25%. Not good news for British clockmakers, but a boost for the German factory floor. It was not only a question of reduced import duties proving problematic. When Britain left the gold standard in September 1931, sterling suffered a short-lived devaluation. Despite this, the unit price for German clocks actually fell in 1932. By mid-decade, the price of German clocks in the UK fell far below the price of the same items in Germany, reportedly as much as 45% below cost in some cases, part of an export drive now clearly sponsored by the German state. How could UK manufacturers make any headway against such determined competition? In part, the survival of the industry relied upon the synchronous clock, as this was not subject to any serious foreign competition. Mass advertising and an appeal to the public to buy British will also have had some effect. But patriotism rarely trumps price. In 1936, after 5 years of operation, ABEC reported making its first millionth platform escapement. It was also the year in which Smiths introduced a new and updated synchronous motor for its clocks, named the Bijou, which was to become an industry standard. One can still find clocks in operation which house a Bijou movement, in some cases working after more than 60 years, and, one suspects, with little or no servicing, testament to quality of both design and manufacture. By 1937, it was already obvious to Smiths that there would be another war. Its chairman's speech that autumn made clear that the work of the clocks division was vital, because in time of emergency it is essential that this country should have factories capable of making the delicate clockwork mechanisms required for the many devices used in the services. And now to the Second World War. Employment in the British clockmaking industry multiplied from a few hundred to many thousands during the 1930s, and clock production likewise increased, from some 24,000 units in 1930, as we've seen, to some 1.5 million per annum in 1938. As a result, the industry entered the Second World War in better shape than it did for the Great War, but nonetheless still inadequately prepared. Shadow factories had been constructed, including what was to become an enormous complex at Cheltenham for Smiths, and across the industry efforts were channeled into war-related production. The statistics for the wartime period are deceptive because we do not know the detailed build-up, but overall, Smiths produced 4 million clocks and clock escapements over the 6 years. Its subsidiary, British Precision Springs, produced 24 million hairsprings, mainly for instruments, and large numbers of these were shipped to both Russia and the United States. Not everything was homegrown. Many items were assembled, either from parts imported or smuggled from Switzerland, or in a combination of domestic and imported parts. As early as 1942, Dennis Barrett became involved in post-war planning, heading the Clockmakers Export Group and lobbying the Board of Trade for government backing for the industry after the war. Not only backing, of course, but protection as well. Smith's motives were clear. It had invested heavily in expanding its productive capacity. It had built the Cheltenham complex and recruited heavily. It was developing a large workforce that was increasingly skilled in volume production of instruments and fine machinery. It knew that there would come a time when this capacity would no longer be needed for war purposes, and forward planning was therefore essential. The experience of recovery from the Great War had been bitter. At the same time, there was a strong desire to see business brought to Britain which had been the preserve of the Swiss, by reason of significant investment, state backing, and a successful PR machine, or the preserve of the Germans, by reason of serious dumping in the 1930s in particular. From August 1944, the government took seriously the post-war development of the clock and watch industry. Smiths took a lead in articulating both the value of the industry and its requirements for support. Barrett argued that considerable effort had been put into re-establishing the clock industry in the 1930s. It would now be possible to continue its expansion, increase employment, and create export earnings, if resources could be redirected in peacetime into the production of a range of products, including simple alarm clocks which had not been mass-produced before, and if imports of clocks could be restricted for some period, either through tariffs or quotas. Watch manufacturing was a somewhat different story. There was no foundation yet on which to build. The Ministry of Aircraft Production had sunk £100,000, perhaps some 3.5 million in today's money, in watchmaking equipment alone at Smith's Cheltenham. Yet, as Barrett admitted, even now, after more than 4 years, we cannot meet the requirements of the services. Despite a variety of problems foreseen in training labour, in jewel production, and indeed from the expected resumption of Swiss competition following the end of the war, the assessment was that, to quote, "the establishment of English watchmaking is of far greater economic value than the clockmaking industry, and it seems well worthwhile preparing a concrete scheme for its expansion." Thus, plans started being formulated for a new industry that would provide everything from high-grade wristwatches to humble bedside alarms. In late 1944, ideas became more concrete, with Smith's acquisition of a site in the Brecon Beacons at Astragynlais, on the understanding that the government would fund the construction of new factory space of some 100,000 square feet, to be rented by Smiths on a long-term basis. One of the long-term uncertainties throughout the war had been homegrown synthetic watch jewel production. Despite a supply of aluminium oxide, arranged with the help of Robert Lenoir, the Ministry of Aircraft Production had failed to master the technology, and quality was abysmal. Smiths took over in February 1945. With plans for the mass production of watches, an ability to make synthetic watch jewels offered neat vertical integration. We move to the post-war period. Reviving an old idea from 1942, Smiths were planning mass production of spring-wound alarm clocks, either in Wales or at Elstree, in a former fuse factory. However, Sir Stafford Cripps at the Board of Trade intervened and persuaded Smiths to site production at their aircraft instrument factory in Carfin, Lanarkshire, the heart of an important development area. Smiths agreed despite a lack of space, and were producing 1,000 alarms per day by year-end 1945, with a waiting list of 300 applicants for jobs pending deliveries of machinery. It was to this same factory complex that Smiths moved the watch jewel operation in 1947, forming Synthetic Jewels Limited. Within 5 years, it was producing 3 million jewels per year. The production of watches was divided between two projects. Robert Lenoir would develop high-grade watch manufacture at Cheltenham, but volume production would be sited at Astragynlais, in partnership with Ingersoll, with whom Smiths formed the Anglo-Celtic Watch Company in May 1945. At inception, the factory worked on piece part production of an Ingersoll-designed pocket watch, moving to the manufacture of inexpensive wristwatches in 1948. There were serious shortages, not only of materials but also of labour. Dennis Barrett wrote to Stafford Cripps in early 1946, "Our prime factories have between half and 5/8 of the complement of personnel they require, and absenteeism is on a much higher scale than it should be." However, with more manpower available in Wales, Smiths secured a second factory at Astragynlais, to which they moved the Enfield clock business in 1947. The relationship between the Labour government and Smiths is evidenced in many ways. Witness Hugh Dalton, the Chancellor, opening the Astragynlais works in March 1947, seeing through an initiative he had been involved in from the outset. The other new venture, at Carfin in Scotland, was by then up to speed, exporting a third of its production and producing its millionth alarm clock in August 1947, prompting congratulations from Sir Stafford Cripps. At Cheltenham, Smith's high-grade watch project was short of both materials and labour. At a planning meeting in mid-1947, it was reported of the factory that, at the moment, it has only 60% of the required labour force. Machine tools were very hard to secure, and Barrett had to persuade the Ministry of Supply to finance equipment on a rental basis. Conditions were much worse at Astragynlais. The standard pattern factory had numerous problems, with its roof, windows and solid fuel heating making it, to quote, far from ideal for the production of high-precision instruments, such as watches, for which dust-free conditions are a prerequisite. Under heavily improvised conditions, Smiths achieved 10,000 units per week by late 1948. But the target was double this and growing, while the economics were not looking good. Since inception, Anglo-Celtic had lost nearly £57,000, equivalent to some £1.7 million now, and it lost nearly as much again in 1948 alone, failing to achieve volumes and efficiencies. Likewise at Cheltenham, stubbornly high production costs continue to mean an internal subsidy was required in order to achieve a workable retail price. By 1948, sentiment towards Germany had changed. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the Allies had carved up Germany between them, with the Black Forest region forming part of the French zone, facilitating the alleged supervised looting of 700 machine tools from Junghans. The British clockmakers wanted German capacity reduced, pointing to Germany's pre-war anti-competitive behaviour and the lack of sufficient UK tariff protection. But from 1948, the broader political and moral climate changed, and the Allied dismantling of German industrial capacity ceased. Germany was no longer a prospective enemy. This role now fell to Russia. However, in 1950, the continued strategic nature of the commitment to watch, hairspring and jewel manufacture, now 5 years after the war had ended, is evidenced by the acknowledgement in Smith's papers and Ministry of Supply minutes that both parties were still subsidising losses. The Ministry of Supply reported to the Board of Trade as follows: Smiths are the only firm manufacturing high-precision watches, and in fact they are the only one ever likely to undertake it. We know they are losing heavily on this project and are subsidising it, apart from assistance given them by the government, from profits made on alarm clock manufacture. At Cheltenham, a man's watch was in full production, and the next important development was a small lady's watch, the size of an old sixpence, a first for the UK. A supersized model was shown to great interest at the British Industries Fair, but it was clear that developing these watches was slow and expensive, 15,000 hours of development time in the tool room alone. Smiths provided an internal subsidy of 12 shillings and sixpence per watch, but Barrett, now renter warden, was also lobbying hard for long-term help from the ministry. With hindsight and the changed perspective of more than 60 years, it might be tempting to think of the 1950s as something of a golden age, reflected in the production of Smith's watches, which are now highly collectible, and the large numbers of mantel clocks that survive to this day, indicating both their longevity for mass-produced products and the fact that families took good care of their clocks and watches. The truth lies elsewhere, for the 1950s saw a profound change in mood for the industry. All sorts of factors came into play. At the macro level, the Conservative election victory of October 1951 ushered in a period that saw the dismantling of the protectionism that had characterized the post-war Labour government. Stafford Cripps, a supporter, retired from politics through ill health in 1950. Alan Gordon Smith died in February 1951, and Hugh Dalton left Parliament with Labour's election loss. Given the close identification of Smiths with its charismatic leader, Alan Gordon Smith, and the enviable networking capacity he had built up over decades, including working in the Ministry of Aircraft Production, his death robbed not only Smiths, but the whole industry of its most powerful advocate. As the scenery changed and these key actors were leaving the stage, it was now the Cold War backdrop that influenced the minds of some civil servants. In 1950, the Ministry of Supply reported that, to quote, the manufacture of alarm clocks on a substantial scale would give us, in the event of an emergency, a large manpower pool, which would immediately be used for the manufacture of fine precision mechanisms, such as fuses. Knowing that the UK imported 2.5 million alarm clocks each year before the war, sufficient confidence emerged that plans to enlarge domestic production were drawn up. Not only could 30-hour alarms be sold domestically, they could be exported in vast numbers. But to do so economically, they needed to be made on a colossal scale. The result was one of the most up-to-date flow production factories in the world, at Wishaw in Scotland. Here Smiths created a plant that could produce 90,000 clocks per week, or 4.5 million per annum. It was opened in September 1951 by George Strauss, Minister of Supply, who was handed Smith's 9 millionth alarm clock at the ceremony. One extraordinary feature solved the problem of adjusting to time the large volume of clocks involved. This was a specially constructed overhead conveyor carrying on average 50,000 clocks, stretching round the entire site. It was in itself a master clock, making a circuit once in 24 hours to an accuracy of a fraction of a second, the timing perfected by English clock systems. A finished clock was placed on the conveyor and would return to the same spot exactly 24 hours later. If it showed a different time from the standard time of the conveyor, a quick adjustment could be made. A simple, yet remarkably elegant solution. By way of context, it is important to remember that the clock industry was still working within government restrictions on the availability of simple raw materials, such as steel. With the rearmament program that coincided with the Korean War, less material was available for non-essential supplies. Beyond this, items such as alarm clocks were still subject to Board of Trade price control orders, though Barrett successfully negotiated to raise the limits in February 1952, allowing a 7 to 10% price increase, reflecting the change of political climate under the new government. Fortunately for Barrett, during his first term as master, more than a year's lobbying paid off, and in July 1952, the Ministry of Supply, now headed by Duncan Sandys, finally agreed to subsidize directly the manufacture of high-grade watches, ending the need for an internal subsidy. The firm also had a new outlet for its watches, having purchased Time Limited on the corner of Piccadilly and Old Bond Street, now Watches of Switzerland. But it was not all good news, and the clock and watch division of Smiths was in trouble. Overall, it made no money. New restrictions on imports imposed in South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia were damaging Smith's sales, and stock was building, absorbing cash. To make matters worse, Barrett could not easily reduce production, as he was locked into material supply contracts that his counterparts refused to alter. Smiths took a significant write-down on its stock of clocks and watches. Margins came under the spotlight. Barrett was achieving less than 3% on sales, while the firm targeted 25% at least. In 1953, Smith's minutes record Barrett's admission that he, to quote, could not see a profit on the sale of high-grade watches for 3 or 4 years. The firm even backed a jeweller in Cardiff, Mr. Keir, who provided higher purchase terms to buyers of Smith's watches. When this proved a success, Smiths rapidly moved to acquire the entire financing operation. But consider the irony. This meant the firm was financing the making of expensive watches at a loss, and then financing retail clients to buy them. Despite this dismal outcome, one bright spot was a significant government contract for the development of a watch to be used by all 3 services. And then in May 1953, the watches received an extraordinary fillip with the successful climbing of Everest by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. While Norgay wore a Rolex to the summit, Hillary was wearing a Smiths Deluxe, made in Cheltenham, for which Smiths had developed a special low-temperature lubricant. A watch now in the company's collection. If 1953 saw Smiths on top of Everest, nevertheless the difficulties of the market meant the state-of-the-art Wishaw alarm factory was already unable to sell its entire output and needing to reduce staffing levels. It operated a 4-day week for several months, and this was symptomatic of a worsening climate. The succeeding years continued to throw up a catalogue of problems. Barrett was regularly faced with underloaded factories and over-high stock levels. By mid-decade, Barrett, Robert Lenoir, and other Smiths colleagues felt distinctly threatened. Talking to the Financial Times in 1956, Barrett reported that Russia was operating a total ban on watch imports, investing significantly and committed to technical training, and furthermore producing 24 million watches per annum, with plans for 50 million. Barrett commented that Russia had but to press the switch to divert supplies to Britain to cause us real problems. With the development of the ideal home, automatic labour-saving controls were the vogue. By the late 1950s, Smiths began focusing less on clocks and watches and more on oven timers, much to the chagrin of Robert Lenoir, as he admitted to the Society of Engineers when he lectured on high-grade watchmaking in 1960. There were some developments still, such as the automatic wristwatch developed by Richard Good and Andrew Fell, which appeared in 1961. But the tide had turned. A lot had changed over 15 years. Clement Attlee had promised to build a new Jerusalem, but despite employment and social benefits, it was in fact largely the strategic defence value that had led his government to support significant funding of a new watchmaking business. The figure of £1 million in assistance is often quoted, and large-scale aid was indeed provided, but in truth government records reveal much of this was in kind, and the total never reached £1 million. We have seen that it was the production of alarm clocks that funded the rest of the project at Smiths, allowing the creation and subsidy of a watch business. An industry target set after the Second World War was the production of 5 million alarms per year, twice the pre-war UK consumption. That target was met by 1950, but sales immediately began to decline, though throughout the 1950s, 50% of clocks produced in the UK were indeed 30-hour alarms. In 1953, Barrett revealed that the Germans could produce them at 15 shillings each, landed in the UK after all taxes and duties, against Smith's price of 19 shillings. Somehow, sales of British-made clocks were maintained through to the mid-1960s, but then came under renewed attack. Eastern Bloc countries began dumping clocks in the Western European markets at absurdly low prices. In 1967, clocks from Hungary that were estimated to cost 15 to 18 shillings to manufacture were being imported into Britain at close to 5 shillings each. By the end of the 1960s, domestic mass production of synthetic jewels, hairsprings, indeed clocks and watches, was largely uneconomic, and Smiths and other makers began winding down or even closing their operations. So where did it all go wrong? A hard battle was fought to re-establish a British horological industry from the time of the Depression onwards. It was a long time in the losing, not least for the tenacious stand taken by several liverymen. Charles Tucker, a liveryman from July 1945, and the son of William Edward Tucker, gave a widely reported lecture to the BHI in December 1947. The lecture reviewed the British horological industry and charted a lot of the difficulties it had faced during the first half of the century. In concluding the lecture, Tucker closed with these remarkable words. We've had our Thomas Tompions, we've had our Daniel Quares, we have had our grand old watchmakers who have made British horology famous in the past. It is a British tradition that we always find a great man in our hour of necessity, and I'm going to suggest to you that we have found the right man at a time when our trade is requiring a leader more than ever before in its long history. He works many hours of the day, and often long into the night, for the future of British horology. It is hardly necessary to mention his name, but it is Dennis Barrett. Few of us realize how much he has done for our craft. Well, we can see there was little industry doubt, at least in some quarters, how significant Smith's contribution had been, and Barrett's in particular. Why was it all not enough in the end? The answer lies in understanding the relationship between wider political objectives and the commercial imperatives that drove Smiths and others. In the 1930s, private sector attempts to grow the industry were hampered by German dumping. Awareness of this influenced wartime planning for a post-war industry. There was a strong coincidence of interest between the industrialists and certain government departments, particularly the Ministry of Aircraft Production and its effective successor, the Ministry of Supply, which accepted the strategic argument of the need for a light engineering capacity that could be turned to war ends in times of emergency. But the development of weapons gradually left behind the world of clockwork fuses. It was another part of Smith's developing guided missile technology which became more relevant. Under the post-war Labour government, building a new Jerusalem did for a time include forging a new horological industry, with an emphasis on the needy development areas of Wales and Scotland. The plans also included education, with the establishment of the relatively short-lived National College of Horology. Alan Gordon Smith, Barrett, Buckland, Stafford Cripps, Hugh Dalton and other Ministry of Supply characters were the prime movers. But in politics, neither the backdrop nor the actors remain static. Policies evolve to suit changed circumstance. Here is the very last image I could find showing Gordon Smith, Buckland and Barrett together, probably from 1950. After Gordon Smith's death in 1951, Barrett was the principal disciple left to maintain the faith. He interpreted his role with great vigour. Indeed, he appears to have seen Stafford Cripps' original backing for the industry as establishing some sort of eternal covenant between government and the horological industry, in which tariffs and quantitative restrictions on foreign imports would remain in place and at effective levels ad infinitum. It's here that we can see Barrett's mistake, emblematic of the mistake made by the whole industry in failing to adjust to a changing climate. Barrett was typical of those who believed Germany should be made to pay for its previous sins. This left him out of touch with mainstream political thinking by 1948 at the latest. Hidden away in a huge volume of interdepartmental correspondence, there is a telling passage in a memo from a Foreign Office official to a colleague in the German section from late 1948. In a comment largely with Barrett in mind, the official wrote, "The Ministry of Supply have been very wrong in their dealings with the trade. In their single-minded zeal for creating a horological industry in the UK, they have, as our files amply attest, too closely identified the security interests of His Majesty's government with the commercial interests in the industry. They've got themselves far too deeply involved in the unsavoury international cartel and trade espionage business." There was much characterization of the clock and watch sector as an infant industry in government documents throughout the late 1940s and 50s. It would never grow to be an adult, for as early as 1948, Barrett's idea of the covenant was no longer shared by incoming officials, who had instead to deal with the realpolitik of rebuilding Germany. As for the Black Forest manufacturers, they were determined to rebuild their pre-war dominance. With an unlimited pool of trained talent, lower wages, and a flexible and extended working week, their productive capacity was enormous. With German government support, a British-German horological trade war was decisively won by Germany in the 1950s. The victory was rammed home yet again 2 decades later with the success of the German quartz clock industry, which, it has been forgotten, anticipated the success and eventual dominance of the Far Eastern producers, and which ultimately caused firms such as Smith's to throw in the towel. There we have it, then, a story of 3 distinguished liverymen, whose achievements for a time brought employment and earnings to several tens of thousands of workers in the watch and clockmaking industry in the middle years of the 20th century. The art and mystery of that modern industry might have puzzled the founding fathers of our company, but Gordon Smith, Buckland and Barrett certainly worked hard to make it prosper.